Welcome to another Directions Mag podcast, co-hosted with our friends at URISA.
Greetings and welcome to another URISA and Directions Magazine conversation. I'm Matt Garricky with URISA's Professional Education Committee, and joining me to talk about data management, data organization, and related topics is Jesus Delgado. Data organization and management is something that all of us do in our GIS professional lives, and probably something we could all improve. In some organizations, this is approached as data governance, but how data is organized and managed has impacts ranging from accessibility and availability to how we work with others. So we'll continue our conversations on this topic and dive in and explore some examples from some other GIS perspectives. Jesus, can you tell us a little bit about your career and your encounters with data and GIS?
Certainly. First of all, let me thank you for the invite to participate in this conversation. My background, I have a bachelor's in marine science and biology, and a master's in marine affairs and policy. And I also have a graduate certificate in GIS that I obtained from the graduate certificate program out of William and Mary, sponsored by the Center for Geospatial Analysis, the CGA. I have been working since late 80s, 1987 or so. I did about 10 years of research in red tide toxins. And for 18 and a half years, almost 19 years, I worked as a supervisor and a biologist for the Division of Environmental Resources Management for Miami-Dade County. Sprinkled in there at some time, either before or after, I did a couple of years of teaching at various levels from elementary school to graduate school in natural sciences. But primarily my GIS use was while I was a supervisor with Miami-Dade County. And they are actually supervised some of the projects for the Class 1 permitting program, which is a coastal construction program, and also some disciplines in marina operating permits, the annual marina operating permit program. I coordinated that for about 10 or so years, and also was involved with the Shoreline Development Review Committee, and reviewed and authorized plans for development as far as the coastal aspect of the projects were concerned. This is where the GIS came in. And so when it comes to visualizing and helping others visualize the impacts of their proposed work, GIS was immediately recognized as a key tool to be able to share that information. And the aspects of GIS management that I recognized that I needed to work more on and to be more proficient at. So that's what brought me to William and Mary for the certificate program there. And as of the past year, I've been very fortunate to serve as an adjunct lecturer at William and Mary, where I've been instructing the laboratory portion of the introduction to GIS, so what we call GIS 201. So it's a very rewarding experience, and I'm really enjoying my time there.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us today and being willing to talk about some of these big questions about data organization and management from your different perspectives as a researcher, as an educator, but also someone working in local government where sometimes the projects are multi-year, sometimes the projects are very short and condensed, but there's also the role of GIS being part of the daily transactional work, the daily workflow, where it's really not a project with a defined start and end. It's just part of what we do all the time in terms of how we use it in the organization or how we go about doing our jobs. So I'm really looking forward to some of the directions that we can take in this conversation. So is organization and management of data and files the lowest common denominator of GIS? Or are there variants of good practices in different sectors?
Well, I do believe that data management and organization do represent a common denominator, in as much as they are all essential skills in order to be able to reach a successful completion of a project. I also recognize that these different practices of data management and organization tend to vary from agency to agency. For instance, from my experience with government work, a lot of them are dependent on the methods of data acquisition and, again, best management practices. Some of the practices are driven by standard operating procedures. That they involve chains of custody and procuring information that might be evidentiary elements or that may be defensible in court. And any and all of those aspects of evidence or data that has been gathered in the field may very well end up being part of a feature class as particular attributes, something that can be visualized and best conveyed via GIS. So from that perspective, you can see how data organization and data management become primordials as an imperative management skill. The variance does exist between the various sectors or various stakeholders who might be involved. And sometimes I think this could be an obstacle to clear communication. At times, the variance may be based on the level of training that different individuals within various groups have received. Not everyone is a certified GIS analyst, and not everyone needs to be in order to be able to participate in a research group for geospatial analyses. Minimal information and a basic understanding, basic knowledge definitely come in to help so that we have a common language and that is understood amongst all parties. But I think that one of the primary things that need to exist is that we need to maintain a common best management practice agreement, best management practices that are accepted and acknowledged among cooperating agencies or stakeholders or research partners. These are practices that we essentially share with the public to ensure transparency. And as a research group, you may draft your own set of best management practices or BMPs. You can you can draft your own to then share, or you can adopt a partner agency's practices if you acknowledge that those are sound practices that benefit your organization. You can present your drafts for your peers or your partners in research for their review and approval. And once you obtain that approval and vetted standard operating procedure, if you would, you could publish those best management practices. So everyone in the group is aware of what the common BMPs are. And I think this helps a lot from a public agency perspective. All the information is subject to production under a public records request. And even the best management practices that one has used for the GIS project would become responsive records to that public request. So having clear, published, transparent transactions and best management practices helps to minimize critiques. And it's also, it allows the research to withstand auditing or scrutiny. Sometimes when you're working with other agencies, you're in a position of compromising. But I mean, you're compromising as to certain methodology so long as it does not compromise the quality or the integrity of the data, I do believe. So in a nutshell, yes, I think they've become a common denominator of GIS practice, but we need to be very certain that the best management procedures are understood and followed by all the agencies that are cooperating in one same project.
That's a great point, that in research or in government, when there's a reliance on the research, or there's a degree of accountability for public bodies, that basing decisions and practices on standard operating procedures or a policy that guides how to do things is really a bedrock of how some of these things get done in the real world.
Absolutely.
But if we start there and kind of jump back, the building blocks of the process really are how we start thinking about data organization when we're learning these things, and we're learning GIS, and we're starting to learn the tools and techniques that we may use in those research or government environments down the road. So if that's where we are professionally, when your GIS class starts at the beginning of the semester and it's intro GIS, and your students really haven't worked with the data or the folders or the file structure, how do you explain data organization and management to your students, and the importance of it?
Well, I bring it in, trying to give them a sense of how important data is. And in my mind, and I share this with the students, data is very much like a treasure. And when you're searching for data, you're essentially on a treasure hunt. You're looking for those valuable bits and pieces of information that will become the backbone of your research. So we touch on different points to make certain that what students have in fact found is treasure, is in fact data that meets a standard of reliability, data that comes from a reliable source, a responsible source, and that we understand that this data is, I mean, the point and the purpose of the data is it an objective foundation? Is it objective truth? Is it based on vetted methods of analyses? Or is the data nuanced? Does the data have a purpose? Is it being understood or manipulated or presented in such a way that is intended to drive a message? Or whether this is just black and white, plain data, these are exactly the results that we obtained. There is no nuance or personal interest in providing it one way or the other. And does it come from a legitimate source? Then, considering that you have now gone out of your way to locate this treasure, now you need to guard that treasure. But you're not going to be like a pirate. You're not going to go out there and bury it and then make sure you dispose of all those people that helped you bury it so nobody else knows where it is. It's a different type of treasure. This data you actually want to make sure that you preserve so others can actually use it as well. So in as much as you want to preserve its integrity, the exercises that we go through with the students involve understanding what a secure location for your data might be, and maintaining that primary secure location so that your original data goes there, and you're working as you're manipulating data, not on the original, but on the copies. You can make copies of that original data. That is what you play with. That is what could actually go through an error. And you're not really losing your original data. That is being guarded somewhere else. That's one file or one file folder that does not get played with. To that end, we go through teaching the students, we teach them how to create a folder structure that will help them organize this data, because they can have it, but they will not know where to put it. Or once they have placed data in different folders, they will not know what happened to that data. So you need to keep track of where your data has gone, and creating a folder structure that we can share with the students as a best management practice or as a best standing operating procedure. It just becomes a habit, and they can start their project and maintain that data in an organized, cohesive way where the data can be accessed and not lost. And with time, students tend to develop their own methodology, but at the beginning, I do encourage them. Okay, here's the folder structure that I have set up for my projects. I encourage you to understand the logic within it and to use this as your backbone for data management.
As you're talking with your students about setting up that file structure and files and folders of folders, are there any naming conventions that you found particularly useful or not useful over your career?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, without a doubt. Well, there are a number of things that come into play. So if we touch on folder structure, let me talk about a little bit about that for a second. When it comes to the project itself, essentially, I'd like to organize it as a system, a main folder, a primary folder, if you would. That's the one that bears the name of my project. And then within that primary folder, I have subfolders, each one identifying the type of file that I am keeping within it, with the idea that I tend to keep like items together. And so I have a very short name for a folder named docs for my documents, obviously. One for data. One is probably labeled IMG for images. I could probably have one for FP for my final products. And then my miscellaneous folder typically is just MISC for miscellaneous. What I keep in there logically, my documents, I keep procedure documents, which is essentially a log of actions or comments that I have as I have proceeded through my GIS project. I enter there my good notes, my bad notes, what worked, what didn't work, how I solved it. I do screen captures to essentially summarize a number of different steps. It's a lot easier to capture a screen and drop it into my document as an image. Say, for instance, I am working on a geo process. I am doing a spatial join. And as compared to writing line by line, what different layers I used and how they were placed within the geospatial tool in the application, I can just drop in that image. And that will tell the 1,000 words, and that will actually save me time. I also have within documents any standard operating procedures that my research group might be following. A document for sources that would let me know where I obtained what piece of information, what piece of data. Any deliverable documents. It could actually contain some of the timelines that I need to maintain to produce, to generate products on a given timeline. I have another folder for data, one for images that would include not only layouts, but any other kind of image that I would like to use for presentations, logos of different groups or agencies that that happen to be working together. My final projects folder typically includes maps or any story map links or anything that I have ready to be published. And in miscellaneous, I pretty much put whatever else I don't know where to put it at, I can put it in the miscellaneous. I also, and I learned from one of my professors at William and Mary, the miscellaneous is a very good place to put in any kind of zip file that I download. And that tends to keep it as an archive of my original clean data there. Now, you mentioned names, and I do believe this is the crux right here. Names are very picky, as we know, when it comes to GIS, or the other way around. Applications tend to be rather picky when it comes to naming. So when teaching, it pretty much emphasized to the students that, look, you don't want to use any special characters on your naming convention. And try to keep your names short. So I recommend that you keep in less than 13 or so characters. So instead of writing the name of a folder as documents or images or final product, I just use an abbreviation that would be clear, not just to me, but to other folks that might be using the folder structure. So do not include any spaces in your names or use numbers to start your file names. And if you're working on producing different versions of your data, let's say, for instance, I am joining two tables of attributes. I don't want to name this join 1, and my next layer I want to name it join 2, because these are not descriptive names. When I come back to it, it is very likely that I will not remember what join was, join 1, join 2. I mentioned to the students that it's best to use a meaningful name. So instead of, doing a join that may say research area projected, or actually, no, if I reprojected my research area as compared to saying research, labeling that new layer research area 2, I want to make sure that the name reflects the operation that generated that new data layer. So I could name it research area reprojected as compared to research area 2. Likewise, following on the example of doing a spatial join or an attribute join, I could call it SJ for special join underscore park roads to park boundaries, where I can understand the initials represent the geoprocess technique that was employed, and then the two names of the layers that were joined together. And I'll tend to include in there as clearly as I can and as short a name as I can, which data set was joined to which. And then I recommend, by all means, store your data layers within your geospatial database. The geospatial database, it's a great strategy in as much as it not only does it keep all your data organized within the geospatial application, but it makes it so much quicker to access. The system knows where to go, retrieve the information. It minimizes your time and effort. So if you are working on a research team, I recommend selecting a simple and clear data organization system. You can create this as a business rule or a best management practice for your research team, and you want to share that with the team and any agency members or any collaborating agencies that you're working with, whether it be the county or the state or the federal government, for instance, and that everyone acknowledges that you're going to adhere to this file organization system or best management practices. So everyone is aware of what the data looks like and where it is stored. And then you save your project. You save it often. When it comes to the students, we try to create this habit from their very first project. And we I tend to let them make mistakes so that they can go back and identify where the thing went off the rails. And I can just let them know, it's okay, your data join is not working because you are trying to store this in a file folder that includes spaces. And that may very well be the thing that is throwing you off. Try to see if you can solve it, delete that space, see if it works now. Oftentimes, a couple of mistakes are made, but after that, the students learn rather quickly how to work with best management techniques.
So one of the things you touched on is versions of projects. And I know in longer term projects or even student projects, you want to save and you want to save early and you want to save often, but you may not completely finish everything in one setting. It may be a multiple day project. And so I'm curious, how you have the conversation about backup strategies. Because as soon as we save the project and we save the data, we can pick up and go and leave. But there's always that chance that something happens to that. And if we don't have a backup, it can be definitely stressful for students, and it probably causes a fair bit of anxiety for other GIS professionals. But do you talk about that with your students? And if you do, what sort of suggestions or strategies or procedures do you recommend so that they not only have a organized manner of backing things up, but they have confidence in knowing exactly what they have or what snapshots or data points that they have?
Well, a couple of strategies come into play here. One of them is when our students start working GIS, at least for the introduction to GIS course, they are working of instructions that we have set up for various activities, and these are the ones that we call labs. So for each one of the lab activities, we have it built in where after so many different geoprocesses or steps, we have it written in there, save your project now. You may want to think about saving your project now. That as a way of creating a habit where the students start to get the notion that I have accomplished something along the way. Even if I'm just sitting at my terminal for an hour, 2 hours, I want to save maybe every 15 minutes, every 10 minutes, or definitely every time I accomplish a geo process that will serve as a foundation for the subsequent processes. Because I have managed a goal thus far, so I want to save this. So also, I think the primary responsibility for saving is the onus is on the cartographer or the researcher, or in this case, the student. You need to save. You're the primary line of defense, so to speak, against any glitches or any power outages, anything that may destroy your effort, so to speak. So you want to save often. I know of at least one of my professors that would set up an egg timer, and this egg timer will go on every so often, maybe every 15 or so minutes, and that would be the reminder to save them, save the information. So even if something were to happen, you might only lose a very small portion of your progress. As a research group or as a class, I think that you want to set a practice whereby you save on a regular basis. You set up a calendar for backup of your computer's hard drive, if you would. You know that you save once a week or twice a week. I know groups that save every night. And that is actually the research group itself as compared to the IT department within that agency. You also want to, so you don't want to leave it up to the IT group. IT might be backing up everybody's progress from the different agencies. I know Miami-Dade County, we had at least 500 different employees, and God only knows how many different groups working in various aspects of environmental resources management. The IT group backed everybody up. But within the group I worked with, we took it upon ourselves to back up our information and our data daily. Because even if it was left to IT to reproduce a lost drive, for instance, you don't know how busy they are and how quickly they might be able to get to your issue and get you up and running again. So that may be a delay on productivity if it happens to be a business or a generation of projects or continuing projects for an agency. And it's definitely stressful, as you mentioned, for the students if they were to lose all of their progress. So, and to that end, having a redundant backup system where it is the individual that is backing up and is aware of how often you need to save your process, your progress, and you become aware, and essentially this becomes a habit. After you hit that one landmark step that you know is going to help you carry on with the work you want to save. If you encounter a glitch, and you know what is the last step that worked, you want to save. Just make sure that, oftentimes the gremlins make it so that you may have to shut down the entire application and then reboot. So you want to have save just before you do that, so you can solve your problems. And from an agency's perspective, I would say that you want to maintain an open line of communication with other groups that are researching in your agency and with your IT group. Um, and say, know your IT, know who is out there, communicate with that personnel frequently. And I say personally, it's like, more often than not, these days we kind of like send an email, pick up a phone, and call someone. But if it is possible for you to walk down to the IT office and personally meet with them so they get to know you, you get to know them, and you establish this professional relationship. I think that that relationship that is rewarding in itself also translates in a good line of communication whereby your interests are shared, and they feel it as, oh, I'm part of that group that Jesus is working with, and I want to make sure that the group is up and running. And you understand their delays and the obstacles they might be facing, and likewise, they understand yours. Um, the nutshell that I would say is save often, save now. It's not my mantra. I have inherited that from my professors, and I will continue to pass that one along to my students.
So through our conversation, we've had examples of teaching and research, but also the work environment. And I think you make a really good point when you talk about, it's not just these people that have these jobs that we rely on. It's also the communication and building and developing the relationships. Because in many cases, our problems or challenges are, they may be technical, but we tend to rely on others to help us with those or figure things out, both in terms of our professional work environment as well as learning from others or teaching others. So as educators, we find ourselves explaining technical concepts in easy to understand ways. And the majority of GIS professionals in the United States do so in English, but we may also be working with people where the native language or spoken language is not English. Could you talk about your experiences explaining GIS concepts, if it's data management or file management or other concepts, to others with a background in other languages? Has that been a barrier, or what strategies have come up to work through approaching a common thing from different experiences?
And you touch on something very interesting, which is both challenging and rewarding at the same time. Yes, most of the work that we do in the United States in GIS, logically, it is in English. But we do have a varied and very rich community of GIS analysts. And oftentimes the thought pattern or the idea behind visualizing data is its nuance or is driven by the idiosyncrasy of the various communities. So I say it's challenging and rewarding because conveying the management for the data or the various strategies to help visualize this data or analyses that must be performed on the data, it demands a bit of creativity and imagination. And it is very rewarding when you get the sense that you were able and you succeeded in conveying not necessarily just the meaning or the outcome, but the nuance that could help the individual or the cartographer or the analyst reach the next step on their own. In a sense, I feel that it enhances my ability to communicate and to convey the idea in a different language. And I think it assists the individual who is listening to me because they get to understand the process in a different way. I think that it also makes them more flexible. Oftentimes, I think that I usually look for an example that I can put together, and that is an example that could be either relatable to either the audience or the classroom. Um, at times, there is no direct translation, for instance, and I think that a knowledge of the actual geo process that you're trying to explain is needed so that you can convey the goal of the geo process in a different way. So, as I mentioned, the cultures and the languages are very rich, but they're also very adaptable. So, in the practice of GIS, what I've seen is that um, the different languages other than English, and we do it in English as well, but we adopt words for which no immediate translation exists. Say, for instance, the majority of my experience is in Spanish. So, for instance, in Spanish, I don't recall if we have a word for flash, like the flash in your camera. But if you talk to anyone in Spanish about a camera flash, you don't have to mention the word flash, they know what it is. So oftentimes then, while some words are adopted and they understood, it's like that is not a word that I regularly use, but it is understood. I have adopted it into my understanding of what the process is supposed to be, and regardless of what it is labeled, I know how to use it. So if you find that one common ground, you can evolve an example from there on how to say, for instance, do a join or to establish a buffer. Let's take, for instance, the concept of buffering. If I speak to any English-speaking GIS analyst about generating a buffer about a point or or around the line, we understand what it is. For me to explain that in Spanish, I would have a hard time explaining to the Spanish speaker audience that or the student that I want the student to generate a buffer. I would probably have to use a combination of words, and this is something else that comes into play. So instead of referring to it as a buffer, I could address what the buffer does. And the buffer essentially creates an area within a perimeter. And I could identify that process as the process generates an area under a perimeter. Some folks may refer to this as a halo, but I would rather not use halo, in as much as they may want to use halo to represent buffers, but we know, for instance, when it comes to labels, that we do use a halo as a label. But I would tend to identify, for instance, a buffer as an area within a perimeter surrounding a particular feature of interest. And incidentally, when it came to labeling something with a halo, I would actually use the word for reflejo. Reflejo would be more akin to a reflection. So essentially, you're reflecting a little bit of that um, font type that you have used for the label itself. So it is challenging, but it's also very interesting. All the nuances, some folks refer to the tab, even the contextual tabs that appear on the ribbon on top of ArcGIS Pro.
Yeah.
They call them pestañas, which are typically eyelashes, but they give you the idea of this is a little tab on top. Others call it lengüetas, or they call it etiquetas. And you know what? I'll take the first two. I'll take pestañas or lengüeta, though I favor pestaña. Well, neither or. Etiqueta is actually label. So I would rather not use label if I'm going to be using label for putting names on features of interest on a map, because those are labels and those are etiquetas. So I definitely have a word that fits that. So Okay, so tabs are pestañas, and I want to keep it that way. I think that when it comes to the use of the software, primarily what we have employed in the CGA at William and Mary, we use a lot of the ESRI products because of the versatility and ease of use when it comes to sharing GIS concepts with students. That platform lends itself very well for it. And I have seen the platform in different languages. And by and large, it works. There's a couple of items that are somewhat nuanced that I would say it still needs to be polished or improved upon, but by and large, it works.
So in terms of talking about, the software interfaces, it's interesting to me that, if we're trying to explain a concept to somebody that comes from a different language background or different vocabulary, and we have these real technical things, that we can explain the concept, and then, hey, here's a label here like buffer that's we have this label, but we can kind of explain the concept behind it. And then we get in the tool, we get in the software interface, and we're clicking on this button that says buffer. In your experience and working with different language settings, are those translations of, buffer from English to Spanish or another language interface that you're working in, fairly accurate and helpful? Or do those sorts of translations within the software interface raise challenges and connecting, these concepts that you're explaining to the buttons or the commands that you'd have to work with in the software?
I think that the effort that's been put together by, for instance, the ESRI group and doing their translation, say, in ArcGIS Pro into Spanish, I think the effort is rather good. The translation of the various tools are logical, and I think that they can be followed. Some issues still remain. For instance, the naming conventions. Naming conventions work, and either they can be generally accepted or adopted or understood in Spanish. All the nuances are not necessarily, they don't necessarily work for all regions. In as much as, say for instance, the Spanish-speaking countries around the Caribbean basin, you could there's different words that are being used around the Caribbean basin to describe particular items or objects that you would not use in the southern portions of South America. So, when it comes to, what backpack might be in Colombia or Venezuela would not be the same word that we would use to describe a backpack in Mexico, for instance. So there truly isn't, and I cannot say that there is an all-encompassing way of translating ArcGIS Pro to Spanish, for instance, that will satisfy everyone. I think that all the users of GIS in Spanish, they need to have a certain level of acceptability to understand, oh, okay, this is what they are referring to. And then the user needs to essentially be clear as to how things are translated. Give you an example. If you were using, okay, when it comes to defaults, oftentimes the geoprocesses or say choices for symbology, they provide you, the system provides you with defaults, and a lot of ways which I've heard the term default referred to in Spanish, they use the word defectos. Defectos, in fact, in Spanish means defects, and it is not what you want to say here. I would not use the word defect or defecto, pardon me, to identify with the fault. I think that a better term for that would be a predeterminado o predeterminada, which essentially means to a predetermined entry. So this is something that has been already provided for you, but it is very, it's tempting to say, I will come up with a word in Spanish that is very close to the word default in English, and would just say defectus because it kind of sounds somewhat similar, but in fact means something entirely different. So my concern is that the practice may continue, and folks that actually are using defectos to refer to defaults would essentially adopt that as a term, as an accepted term, and it is in fact, in my opinion, not the proper term to use for that. There is a group pretty much that just pretty much says that you really should go on with trying to use the interface in English. On the one hand, I think that they are looking at it from the personal growth perspective, and that it also will enhance that cartographer, so that analyst's ability to work in a different language. So it has its challenges, but definitely something that one could adapt to. You know, incidentally, now that we're talking about that, and we have been talking about naming conventions, when it comes to naming files, and you know how we don't use numbers to start the file with, or spaces, or special characters, there are characters in Spanish that, like the ñ, which is the N with the little tilde on top, or the U with two dots on top, that actually is used regularly in Spanish, but they used to generate errors. I'm not sure what the latest versions do with it now, but certain letters or characters that would normally be accepted in Spanish are not necessarily accepted in English, or actually in the software that is understanding everything you enter as in English. So I don't know, but I found that, or I recognize that was another curious detail to think about or keep in mind.
Wow, we've talked through many different examples today from a number of different perspectives. Do you have any other heads up about curious little gremlins lurking in the software, or how we think about using it, or how we understand how we use it, or any final tips, tricks, or strategies to share from your experiences working with and teaching GIS?
Think that regardless of language, the practice of analyses and the way in which we go about it, it's a common cause, so to speak. It makes no difference what language you're speaking. Ultimately, we're all speaking a GIS analyst language, and that comes in my mind with a number of practices. I would recommend definitely that a GIS analyst maintain a process document, and that in that document you enter the good days and the bad days. You will be helping others. I mean, should you win the lottery today and leave your research group and somebody else come in to take your seat, you would be leaving a gift for that individual if you have a process document with the good and the bad, that person would know what mistakes not to make, because you made them and you recorded it in there and you left it as a legacy for the next individual to say, don't do this. I did it. And you're writing for somebody else's eyes. And that one actually comes in from my background in working in marine biology and working out on boats. That pretty much says there is no hardware store nearby to go get a spare part, and you prepare yourself for everything. So you write a comprehensive, understandable log that you can hand off to someone else down the line. I would also say that you want to maintain a time log, even as a student. That will help you visualize where your time has gone and how much effort you have put into a particular part of the project. It also helps to track efficiency or let you know how effective you have been. It lets you know whether you have taken too much time analyzing a project. Sometimes you have to step away from the interface and then return to look at it with fresh eyes. So a time log does help. I mean, it helps you with billing if you're working for a private interest. And I think it also helps you help manage your effort and manage your sanity. I would say definitely understand what the best management practices are for organization and data management. Those are extremely important when it comes to being able to work in a group in a seamless fashion. If you are working with a group, I recommend to the students, and one of our final projects involves work group for them. Some of them are looking forward to working in a group. Some, I tell you, are definitely not looking forward to working in a group. But it's rare for any one professional to work in isolation these days. You are part of a group more often than not, and whether you like it or not. And I think that group work is a great experience and a great opportunity for students right now. So I share with them, it's like, understand when this data is your data or the group's data or the agency's data. Don't necessarily be married to your data, that you are the protector and nobody else touches this data, unless you happen to be the data manager, the GIS manager, that is responsible for ensuring the quality control of that data. More often than not, you maintain control over the final product and access to that data. But if you're a member of a group and you're working together with other analysts, you want to be receptive to alternate points of view. They may have different ways of solving a problem or to display the data. And when I receive input from colleagues, I just tend to not look at it as a challenge. I interpret it as a positive commentary and suggestion. Try to be open to new alternative and new methods. In reality, regardless of how much time you have been working in GIS, we're essentially all learning GIS, and I think it's a process of improvement as you make your way through in that career. So as far as being able to suggest to students or other professionals, from my experience, I think that those are the more important, more salient points that I could recall. Maintain transparency. That is one key aspect, I think, very valuable when it comes to working for a public agency, whereby everything that is being done by the group stands scrutiny. And from a scientific point of view, I mean, you want to be able to have others validate your data. You want peers to take a look at what you've done and understand clearly how you got to the end point and why you're representing the data the way you are and what the message is. And you want that research to stand scrutiny as well. I think that is a good message to provide with students today that are going to become those future researchers and GIS analysts.
Well, thank you for joining us today for this conversation and sharing your thoughts from your experiences working in government, working in research, and working as an educator about some of these strategies and challenges that no matter the type of GIS work that we do, we have. If it's with language, if it's with organization, if it's with working with others, plenty of good talking points and perspectives. So thank you so much for your time and sharing your experience with us.
Oh, likewise, it's my pleasure to visit with you today and have this very interesting conversation. You know, I think that all these points are a reality for GIS in teaching and also in public service. And I think there are always an opportunity for improvement, continued improvement. So again, my pleasure. Thank you very much for your time.